اللهم صل على سيد محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So we've arrived at the last three aphorisms, and these last three aphorisms are aphorisms that Ibn Ajiba, in his categorizing of them, refers to these aphorisms as the aphorisms that deal with the a'mal, the actions of ihsan, the actions of ihsan. And what is ihsan? The Prophet ﷺ said, al-ihsan, which is translated sometimes as spiritual excellence, is أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as though you see him. فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. And if you're unable to see him, then know that he sees you. And so now the idea is that, and as we've gone from these actions of the inward, which, just to recap, are pretty much from aphorisms 10 onto aphorisms 13, 10, 11, 12, and 13. They're all about working on that heart so that heart is illuminated. Because it is not the eyes that go blind, but it is the hearts within the chest, as the Quran says. And so, what is it that lets you enter into this state of ihsan, which could be defined as the peak experience or the spiritual apex, the spiritual realization of our Islam and our Iman? If we are engaging Islam the way it should be engaged, and it's not Islam, which is spelt the same way but is really an identity project. If we're not involved with the Islam of the identity project, but the Islam of man aslama nafsahu lillah, the Islam of the one who submits that egoic self and lets go of that egoic self, and by the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala negates that egoic self so that it becomes dissolved and annihilated in the truth of who that person really is and who Allah really is, then he moves into the tahqiq, the realization of what Islam and Iman really is, which is to bring him to ihsan, to bring him to a state of a mashhad, a state of a something to be witnessed, mushahada, that he is being created to witness something. And this is why the ulama say that the secret to you being called insan, the secret of you being called insan, which is the Arabic word for a human being, is that the word insan also is the word for the black pupil of the eye in Arabic. Insanul ayn, the black pupil of the eye, which is the very thing that through its intake of light allows you to see this world. So you have been created in many ways as a vehicle for this light so that seeing can happen. Seeing can happen. Witnessing can happen. Which is why the primal imprint on what makes you a human being was a form of witnessing. If we rewind sacred time to the time before you were created in this world, at the time you were in the alam al-arham, beyond that to the alam al-arwah, the alam al-amr, to the abode of the souls, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gathered all the souls and arranged them in what is known in the Quran as when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And this word alast is what they call the mithaq, the covenant of alast. Am I not? The covenant of am I not? And so when Allah said, Alastu bi rabbikum, all of the souls responded. Every single soul responded, Qalu, Bala. And Bala is not saying yes. Bala is an affirmative of saying yes in a way that you are affirming something that is being experienced. And that's why it's often translated, yes, indeed. Bala. And what was the experience that they had? Bala shahidna. We have witnessed you. So what defines you at the level of your soul is this witnessing. And and you are born on the imprint of this witnessing. أي كل مولود يولد على فطرة. This witnessing is what is called eventually the fitra, that is the imprint or the sense of that witnessing in your soul. And Islam is the means by which you return back to that witnessing. That is ihsan. And that's why the goal of Islam isn't that you just stop at a level of saying, I'm better than everyone else, I'm Muslim. No, that's not the goal of Islam. The goal of praying isn't that you rack up your rewards, some transactional prayer. The goal of zakat isn't that you rack up your rewards. The goal of hajj isn't that you say, I have the title al-hajj. Every single aspect of Islam is intended to break the veil of separation, to break the veil and to return you back to Tawheed, but an experiential Tawheed, not a Tawheed you can put in the abstract mind, not a Tawheed that you put up on the wall, but a Tawheed of vision, because Tawheed is literally a verbal noun. Wahada yuwahidu tawheedan. It is something that is to be done. How can you make Tawheed? Yes, at some level you can cognitively make Tawheed. There is a cognitive dimension to Tawheed. What a difference between someone who has ilm al-yaqeen, someone who has some knowledge that they then have certainty of, and who has ayn al-yaqeen, who has the certainty of seeing. ليس الخبر كالعيان, as the scholars say, being informed about something is not seeing, is not the same as seeing it. And brothers and sisters, Allah is constantly showing us things to see. Allah says, "Sanurihim," we will show them in a form of vision. Vision, nurihim, ayatina, our signs, fil afaq, in your horizons, wa fi anfusihim, and in your own selves, until it becomes clear, annahu al-haq, that He is the truth. Then Allah says, is it not sufficient that He is over all things, Shaheed? Because if you really come to see Him in the signs, in the horizons, and in your own selves, and you realize Annahul Haq, that He is the absolute reality of everything that is being shown, then you realize that He is Shahid, He is the Shaheed, and He is the Mashhood. And is there ever anything else other than the signs in your horizons and the signs in you? Wheresoever you look, even when you look all the way in the stars, that's just still your horizon. And even if you look inwardly, some of us have adapted this ability, you have this ability to look inwardly. And this is a skill we need to do because the Quran says signs in you. So can you look inwardly? Can you peer within? Which entails you have to enter this domain of khayal, of imagine, to peer inwardly, to see the inward dimension in you. So if you peer inwardly also, every single aspect is just a sign pointing to Annahul Haq, that He is the truth. Every single thing is saying, فَأَيْنَمَا تَوَلَّوْا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God seeking to be manifest. Well, is being manifest, but seeking to be seen in that manifestation. هُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. His witness is with you wherever you are. And it's a witness that is not a witness of time and place, but it's a witness that transcends and incorporates every single dimension we can think. But it's a witness that requires you to connect to who you really are and what you've been really created for. And so that's why Ibn Ajiba says these last three aphorisms, he's assuming you're ready. Ibn Ta'ala is saying he's assuming you're ready. He's assuming that from the beginning, when we undid this sense of reliance on our deeds, the sense of reliance on our situations, the sense of reliance on my power of manifestation, the sense of reliance on a transactional dua, and we entered into tajreed, a stripping, a stripping, a stripping, a slavehood, a slavehood, a slavehood for Allah, a flattening, a flattening, a flattening of that ego, a flattening of that ego. Then we go into the inward, then we focus on tafakkur, this inward reality of contemplation, and then we come to the strength of sincerity for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and undo these senses of attachments to other than Him. Then your heart becomes illuminated, because that's why the previous aphorism was all about the illumination of the heart. And if the heart becomes illuminated, then seeing things or seeing the signs as being pointers to Allah is only the natural state of the affairs. What is more of the strange thing is that everything is pointing to Allah, and Allah is being manifest in everything, and yet we don't see. Yet we don't see. Yet we're not given to be people of witnessing. Yet, as Ibn Ajiba says, most of the believers are veiled. Veiled believers. That's okay. Inshallah ta'ala, Allah will show them His reality in Jannah. يوم إذن. They say, وجوه يومئذ ناظرة. Faces on that day are resplendent. And they say, إلى ربها ناظرة, because they are given to seeing the face of their Lord. And that is the reality of Jannah. So the Sufis are just saying, why wait to die to enter into that reality? Die before you die. Die the death of the ego. Undo that death so that you can enter into this witnessing. And that's why these last aphorisms are all about witnessing things as they really are. And that's why aphorism number 14, which we're going to cover today, and maybe just have a little bit of introduction to 15, is aphorism number 14 says, Al-Kawnu, the entirety of this universe, is kulluhu zulmah, is darkness. وإنما أناره ظهور الحق فيه, but indeed it has only been illuminated by the manifestation of al-haq. As we said, Allah shows them the signs in the horizons and in themselves, حتى يتبينوا أنه الحق, that it becomes clear that He is al-haq. The Sufis love this name for Allah. Al-haq. Al-haq means the true, the real, because everything else at some degree is batil, false. And so the manifestation of al-haq is what gives light to this universe, because otherwise, if you look at this universe without the manifestation of Allah, then it's really zulma, darkness. And by darkness, it means you're gazing upon things without realizing real existence in it, because you're caught with the materiality, you're caught with the opaqueness, you're caught with this sensoriality without seeing that things in and of themselves are adam, they have a nothingness, and they only have ijad, a beingness, through Allah. But if you don't see the true Allah, then you're with the darkness. And that's why, as I said in the previous lesson, Sheikh Al-Alawi Al-Mustaghanami, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Alawi Al-Mustaghanami, a great scholar, said, he would actually turn this aphorism the other way around. He would say, Al-Kawnu kulluhu nurun. The reality is, the entirety of this universe is light. وَإِنَّمَا أَظْلَمَهُ, and that which has caused it darkness is ظهور النفس فيه, is the manifestation of the ego in it. because the ego is what is inverting the real state of affairs. But you could take it both ways. So now Ibn Ata'illah says afterwards, he says, فَمَنْ رَأَى الْكَوْنِ, someone who sees the universe, وَلَمْ يَشْهَدْهُ فِيهِ, and I want you to pay attention to the adverbs being used here, and he doesn't see him in it, فِيهِ, أو عنده, or inda is with it, almost like a sense of being with it. أو قبل معي you'd call in Arabic. أو قبله, or before it. أو بعده, or after it. فقد أعوزه وجود الأنوار. And أعوز is something being in need of something. So such a person is in need of light. He is being bereft of light because he's not seeing the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as being connected to things. And we're going to discuss the use of these adverbs very shortly. But they all point to degrees of perception. They're not adverbs of in the way we conventionally understand time and place. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond hulul wal ittihal, they say in Arabic. He's beyond hulul wal ittihad. He's beyond um, incarnationism. He's being beyond being incarnate in something and ittihad and being joined to something. These are not things that apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If anything, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who brings about all existence. So there can't be any of these dimensions. But so they're not temporospatial, even though adverbs conventionally are interpreted to be temporospatial. In this context, they're not, but they're meant to indicate ways of perception, and we'll discuss how. But if a person doesn't see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in things, it doesn't perceive the real, as we say, the name of Al-Haq, the one who's real in things, then he's in need of light. حُجِبَتْ عَنْهُ شُمُوسِ الْمَعَارِفِ بِسُحْبِ الْأَحْفَارِ. And he's veiled from the sun of gnosis. And what it means here is the light is still there. He's veiled from it by the clouds of the created things. In other words, he's veiled from the ever-present light by the elements, which themselves, actually, by the way, because the clouds themselves can only be seen through the presence of the sun. But he's using it as an analogy here, is that the very materiality that he's attached to exists through that light, but yet he's veiled himself from it, from the original source of, from that materiality, the original source that is behind the clouds. So we're going to read a little bit of the commentary here of some of the scholars. And on this one, actually, what's very interesting, Ibn Ajiba doesn't go that much into the pronouns, but Ibn Abad al-Rundi does. He does say that many of the Arifin would often say, وقال بعضهم, Ibn Ajiba says, ما رأيت شيء إلا رأيت الله فيه. He said, I never saw Allah except that I saw him in it. And he said, وَلَمْ أَرَهْ حَدِيثًا, and I never saw something that's contingent. إِنَّمَا هُوَ من قول بعض العارفين فأهل السير من المريدين يشهدون الكون ثم يشهدون المكون عنده بأثره. So he said, often the people who are still traveling, who haven't arrived, they're given to seeing the universe, and then they see the mukawin عنده, or after him, through his athar, through his trace. And this is different to the people of Allah, the Arifin, because one of the things that Ibn Ajib actually quotes Mawla Abdus Salam ibn Mashish radiallahu anhu, who we said was the teacher of Abu Hassan al-Shadili. So Ibn Ajib quotes him as saying to Abu Hassan al-Shadili, he says, Ya Abul Hassan, he said, make your gaze of your iman true, and then you will witness Allah, you will find him in everything. You'll find him في كل شيء عند كل شيء, with everything, ومع كل شيء وقبل كل شيء وبعد كل شيء. So he's using the same pronouns, with him, in everything, with everything, before everything, and after everything. And then he goes on to add a few more. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَتَحْتَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. Adds every single pronoun. And then it says, but this is outside of any dharfiyah, any sense of time and place, or amakin wal jihad, or a location or direction. وعن الصحبة والقرب وبالمسافات, or a sense of closeness with distance. But this is a type of realization of these pronouns in a way that supersedes all of these things. So what does that mean? So this is where Ibn Abad al-Rundi's commentary is actually more beneficial, and I zoned in on the key paragraph here. If you have access to Ibn Abad's commentary, what he says is, so he says, فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ لَمْ يُشَاهِدْ إِلَّا الْأَكْوَانِ. There are from the believers those who do not see except the universe. And what does that mean? This goes back to Ibn Ajiba's definition that most of the believers are believers who are veiled. And most of the believers are believers who are veiled. وَحُجِبُوا بِذَلِكَ عَنْ رُؤْيَةِ الْمُكَوِّنِ. And so they are veiled by looking at the universe from seeing the mukawwin, the one who's bringing it about. And so he says, in reality, this is a type of dhulumat, a type of darkness. And so they are the ones who are mahjubun bisuhub al-athar al-kainat. They are the ones who are veiled by the clouds of the creative traces of this universe. Now, this is very interesting because before I go into the pronouns, how many a time in when you're discussing, for example, kalam discourse or evidences for the proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there's this idea that these are somehow great forms of proofs. You know, we have this idea of, for example, we have the kalam cosmological argument, which is considered a great proof for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so and so that we've even got Christians who've kind of taken it on board. You know, someone called William Lane Craig has taken on board the Kalam cosmological argument. And in many ways, these arguments are rational arguments. So they are the forms of arguments that you use for people who they need these kind of arguments. But basically, it's based on saying everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe begins to exist, therefore, universe has a cause, and then finally, that cause is understood to be the cause that cannot be given to a temporal beginning and has to be powerful, timeless, and essentially the first cause outside of this cycle of causality, and therefore a God. Now, this is a rational way to try and prove the existence of God. But if we take what's being said here within the Sufi paradigm, it's actually premised on darkness to some degree. It's premised on darkness because it's premised in the first place to saying you have to prove something that should be the most apparent thing. You have to prove something rationally that should be the most apparent thing from a position of perception, Allah's existence. But here in this rational proof, what's being inferred by the proof is you can only go from that which is more apparent in this proof, which is what's posited to be the universe. You're saying the universe, you can't deny the universe. You can't deny that I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, I'm feeling this. There is a physical universe here. And then you're using the universe to infer rationally that there is a creator. And sometimes within the Kalam kind of discourse, some of them say, oh, this was what Sayyidina Ibrahim was being engaged with in Surah Al-An'am when he was using the arguments of the arguments of the different uh, signs. So the Quran says in Surah Al-An'am verse 76, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فلما جن عليه الليل رأى كوكبا قال هذا ربي فلما أفل قال لا أحب الآفلين. So he says, when the night grew dark upon him, he saw a star and said, this is my Lord. But when it set, he said, I do not love things that set. And then after that, it says, فَلَمَّا رَأَى الْقَمَرَ بَازِغًا قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي فلما أفل قال لئن لم يهدني ربي لأكونن من القوم الظالمين. But when the moon rose and so the sun, the stars have gone, he said, oh, this is my Lord, because this is, this is more luminous than the stars. But when it disappeared, he said, if my Lord does not guide me, I will certainly be one of the misguided people. And then فلما رأى الشمس بازغة قال هذا ربي هذا أكبر فلما أفلت قال يا قوم إني بريء مما تشركون. And then when he saw the sun shining, he said, this must be my Lord, it is greatest. But when it set, he said, oh my people, I totally reject whatever you associate with Allah. And then what does he say after that? إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين. I've turned my face towards the one who originated the heavens and the earth, being Hanifa, this purely upright, and I'm not those from Mushrikeen. So some people say, oh, here Sayyidina Ibrahim is using a rational kalami discourse, and it could be said he's using a rational discourse here. But some people make the mistake of thinking he is Sayyidina Ibrahim himself. He's actually believing in these things himself. And hasha min dalik. Absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. Because the prophets have the greatest level of perception. And so, how can a prophet of Allah be thinking that the star is the Lord? He's rather showing the foolishness to the mushrikeen, those around him, by showing that their dependency on objects of their perception is what causes the problem. And that's why he's using an ascendancy of luminosity. He starts from the star, then he goes to the moon, and then he goes to the sun. Hada Akbar, this is the greatest, right? This is the greatest, because this is the source, and the celestial sense of what we're seeing is where all of the light's coming from. But when the sun sets, what does he say? Ya qawm, inni bari'un mimma tushrikun. Oh, my people, I reject whatever you associate with Allah. To say that it cannot, this luminosity, this intrinsic luminosity is not object-based. Inni wajahtu wajha lilladhi fatara as-samawati wal-ard. You turn your face towards the one who was originating the heavens and the earth. Turn your face towards the one who Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, the light of the heavens and the earth, the light who gives the light to the stars, the light who gives the light to the moon, the light who gives the light to the sun, the light who gives the light to your own being, the light who gives the light to your own seeing, the light who gives the light to your own hearing, the light who gives the light to your own sense of I am. Hanifan. That is the purity of worship. وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. That is the purity of worship. And this is what the Sufis are trying to say. That as long as you are bound by objects, and that's why the Kalam cosmological argument can be used for people. Just as Sayyidina Ibrahim was using it. But don't you make that the summation of your own faith. Subhanallah, Fakhruddin al-Razi was this great mutakallim, this great theologian. And he was once walking in a procession, and as many of the students do in their avidness for the teacher, said, get out the way, the sheikh's coming, get out the way. And there was this old woman, they said, get out the way, the sheikh's coming. He said, who's this? Fakhruddin Razi is passing by. They said, don't you know Fakhruddin Razi? He's memorized 100 proofs for the existence of God. And she said, 100 proofs for the one who is the source of all proofs, the one by which existence itself is. If he didn't have 100 doubts, he wouldn't need 100 proofs. And Fakhruddin Razi happened to hear her say this, and he said, oh Allah, we ask you for the faith of the old women. And that's why they say Fakhruddin Razi later, towards the end of his life, he encountered Sufis, and then he took the Sufi path. So then this became a more mature development in his own development. But the very idea that we have to go into this means that means this, that this points to this points to that, this points, and therefore God exists, is a sign that we are in need of light. We're in need of light because we've not reached the point of perceiving things as they really are. And now you see the role of these adverbs, because Ibn Abad-Rundi says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ لَمْ يَحْجُبْ بِالْأَكْوَانِ عَلَى الْمُكَوِّنِ. And then there are those who are not veiled by the veils from seeing the one who's bringing the cone, bringing the universe. ثُمَّ هُمْ فِي مُشَاهَدَاتِهِمْ إِيَّهُ فِرْقٌ. And they are in their perception of Allah, different groups. So now we're seeing that the use of these adverbs are not adverbs to do with time and place, but they are adverbs to do with perceptions of theophany, perceptions of the way in which Allah is being manifest. These adverbs mark the ways of seeing God through creation, right? And from them, there is the type that is after, ba'dahu. This is the type that we were discussing. This might not be seeing even. For some people, it's just rational. But there are some people who sometimes rational istidlal, rational determinacy can lead to a type of vision. So he said there are some who ba'dahu, they infirm God after considering the world. They go from the traces of his effects to the cause to realizing the oneness of his reality. And this is a mediated form of seeing, but it's premised on starting from that, which is actually the most apparent thing to disclose Allah, the world. So it's using the world as a form of proof, we said. So this is the use of the adverb ba'dahu, after it. So the after seeing the cone, so they see the cone first. And when they're seeing the cone first, the fact that they're not seeing God in it or with it or before it means they're actually veiled to some degree. But after they've seen him through a state of istidlal, through a state of reasoning, they come to some type of witnessing. And then it says, there are those who see him قبله, أي من شاهد المكون قبل الأكوان. So there are those who are seeing him in the position of close. When you say qabl, if you're seeing God as before, then this is a type of rare experience, but this is what the Sufis would call fana, an annihilation. A person becomes so absorbed in the one that he doesn't see the means of what the one is being created, the wasita. So he becomes so absorbed and kullu shay'in halik illa wajha. Everything is perishing except his face. So sometimes a person can be so given to that witnessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they don't see things at all. And this is seeing him before. So this is a sublime form of witnessing, but it isn't the more complete form, because fana is always seen from this perception as being a type of seeing that is not complete. That's why the Sufis don't say the goal is fana. The goal is baqa ba'd al-fana, or jam' or farq, the joining of seeing the oneness in the apparency of many, or being with the one, subsisting after fana. So here, the word fana here, it's not implied, it's not directly said, but here is what meant by qablahu. And then here there are two uses of the word in it, a fihi wa indahu, a with it. So Ibn Abad-Rundi makes a very interesting distinction here. He says there is the people, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ شَاهَدَهُ مَعَ الْأَكْوَانِ. They see him with the universe itself. والمعية ها هنا إما معية الاتصال وهو شهوده في الأكوان. And so this seeing him with the universe is a seeing of connection, اتصال, when you see him in universe. So the very point they look upon the universe, and Allah says, قُلْ انظُرُوا ماذا في السماوات والأرض. Look at what is in the universe. So when they look at the universe, this in it becomes this underpinning of what is the ground of being. So it's a very penetrative looking. And this is what these scholars call the mushahada of the af'al or sifat, that you are looking at things and straight away you're witnessing God's action in each of these things. So you're seeing his giving existence, you're seeing his sustaining, you're seeing his disposing, and the world is becoming like a mirror. And that's why he calls it ma'iyat al-ittisal. But then he says, وَإِمَّا مَعِيَةَ الْإِنْفِصَالِ. Now, what's interesting, he says, now, or it can be the witnessing of infisal, which is very interesting. What is infisal here? Infisal is now a witnessing where you're witnessing it with a type of separation. So the thing is your locus, but your gaze moves to God in it, right? So you're seeing God in it. Whereas when you have let me just go back. So the witnessing fihi is the ma'iyat al-infisal. Sorry. So you've moved from that locus and you're literally seeing God in it. Whereas when you say wa imma what you say wa huwa shuhud 'inda al-akwan, when you see him 'indahu, then this is ma'iyat he calls it ittisal, the locus of connection. When you're accompanying with it, you're beholding the haqq, the real, with it in a single non-sequential gaze. So basically you're affirming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala straight away. Now, how would we see this in an analogy, just to make it more clear? The ma'iyat al-infisal would be, you notice, for example, a colored pane, and then you're noticing the light in each colored pane. So you're stopping at each pane. Whereas if you were to see Mayatul Ittisal, you're seeing Indahu with it, then you're seeing every single pane as interconnected as a luminous field, and you're just seeing the modes of light in that. So you're taking it as a totality. Or another analogy would be where you're seeing Infisal, you're seeing a wave, and you're seeing each wave as being the sea, and the sea being represented in the wave. So you're seeing the wave as individual, but you're seeing the sea represented the wave. Or ma'iyya al-indahu wal-ittisal, the connection in which you're seeing the sea with the waves, and you're seeing it all as just the ocean that's appearing wave-like. So these are ways of perception, that there is now a deeper perception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is either in it, which is infisalun, or indahu, which is ittisalun, but they are both pointers to what would be called by the Sufis baqa. They are nearer in presence than what was fana, which was seeing him before it. So now the Sufis call it baqa because you are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in all of these things, Ibn Badarundi says that all of these things are وهذه الظروف المذكورة ليست بزمانية ولا مكانية. All of these adverbs that are used are not adverbs of time or place, but they are rather and they're not اتصال والانفصال المذكوران من حيث المسافات. They're not connection and disconnection from position of actual physical distance. ليس على ما يفهم من معانيهما. They're not what's understood by conventional time and place. فإنهما أيضا من جملة الأكوان. Because if you were to apply all of this, this itself is time of the universe. What is rather implied by this is an epistemic shift, to shift in your perception. That how deep is your perception going? So is your perception from those who are seeing the universe before they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they seeing so if they're from those who are seeing universe before they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they are people of istidlal? Or are you from those who are seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before the universe, in which case you are from those who are fana, right? And if your vision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is after you've seen the universe, then you're those of istidlal. Or are you from those who are seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a seeing that is infisalun, that is penetrative, that makes you see Allah's oneness in things? Then you are kind of seeing him fihi. This is a mushahad of acts and attributes. Or are you seeing him in a way that's ittisal, that is connected, in which case you are seeing him in this absolute completeness, no before and no after, and seeing the things through the whole. You're affirming the means through the whole. So this is all ways of perception, and inshallah we'll go to the next aphorism just to point as to why he's going through this perception, because he says in the next aphorism, he says, مما يدلك على وجود قهره سبحانه أن حجبك عنه بما ليس بموجود معه. He says, from that which shows you the existence of his omnipotence is that For the likes of me, when we're still veiled despite these high degrees of discussion, he says, he's veiling you through a non-existent veil. Because if everything is manifesting him, how can you be veiled? So the very fact that you are veiled is actually revealing his qahariya, his ability to overpower you in this immensity of manifestation. So we'll discuss that in the next class. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. If anyone has any questions or comments about the class we covered today, it's pretty heavy stuff. And by the way, as we come, these are actually some of the most intense aphorisms, 14, 15, 16, in the entirety of the Hikam. And I have alluded to why they are like this to some of you before, but inshallah, when we discuss the overall structure, he's basically trying to throw you into the divine presence very early on. So he's actually bringing the entirety of the Hikam almost as a microcosm early on, inshallah.